Hello and welcome to the episode. I'm really excited to have a guest on today. We have Trisha Carter joining us all the way from Australia. It's absolutely brilliant to have you on the show. And I'm really excited to talk to you about all things cultural intelligence today.
It's lovely to be here. Thank you, Victoria, for inviting me.
Well, I know that you have been in the world of cultural intelligence for a while, and I've been following your own podcast, The Shift, and I felt it was really important to have you on the show to bring your perspectives on this. And, where I'd love to start is just talking about some of the challenges, some of the frustrations that you see teams and leaders having today.
Yeah. I think, there are some things, and you're right, Victoria, like you, I've been around for a while in terms of doing this work, and there are some things that haven't changed and don't change. There are still people with different ways of working, different preferences around, their communication styles or their leadership styles, and others who do them things differently. And sometimes that is due to culture, sometimes it's due to age, it might be due to gender, but you've got these differences and people can rub each other up the wrong way. And so they have those frustrations and challenges in the teams because they do things differently, which is one of the joys of life, that people do things differently, but it can also be one of the challenges that we face. I was talking to David Livermore, who is one of the CQ experts, and he was speaking about some research that he had recently done, and he was talking about it as looking at the pain points that create friction. And so some of those pain points around power or risk or messaging, those are the sorts of things that are still with us today. And so that, I think that's consistent, and I'm not sure if that's what you're seeing as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's so fascinating for me that it doesn't matter, what the sector is, it doesn't matter what the department is, those are universal
Yes.
frustrations, right? And I love the way that, you said David talked about it as pain points. And I think pain points, it sounds very strong. Like it sounds like it's really a very strong physical reaction, but it can be, right? It can be
Yeah.
something that is mentally frustrating, emotionally carries cognitive load. And well, hopefully not physically, but obviously in extreme situations that can lead to stress and burnout, right?
Yes, that is true too. Yeah. And also, if you're thinking about, perhaps traditionally where the CQ work began was thinking about global mobility, with Sunang's work in the turn of this millennia, and the people who are moving around the world looking at the Y2K bug. And if you think about those people, there's also that sense of belonging or failure to belong that can have those real deep sense of um, uh, discomfort is really too calm a word for it. I think it is the stress, and it is, it can be a real psychological trauma for people if they feel like they really don't belong. And so being able to overcome some of those challenges is one of the joys of the work, because we can help people to recognize who they are and to be proud of who they are and give them the capability to work with people who are different to them. Yeah,
Mm.
regardless of what those differences are.
And you've mentioned CQ a couple of times already. I mean, I'm very familiar with the word, but perhaps we should just take a step back at this point. And can you just talk to us about what is CQ? What is cultural intelligence in your view?
Yeah, because it can sound a bit jargony, can't it? Really, I think the simplest way of thinking about it, when people say, "What do?" I help people to work well with people who are different to them. And I think that's what cultural intelligence is. It's the capability to operate effectively in situations of diversity. But what it really means is that it helps you to get on well with people who might be different to you. And, we've already touched on what some of those differences might be. There's four different capabilities, if you like, within the CQ concept. And so the first one is drive, and that motivation, the desire, the energy to work with somebody who's different to you. Then there's the knowledge. Sometimes you need to know things about how people are similar and different. And then there's CQ strategy, which is really how we think about our thinking. It might be how we plan, it might be how we reflect on ourselves and on others, but it's that sort of metacognitive, what goes on inside your head stuff. And then the last bit is doing stuff differently, so CQ action. So there's those 4 different areas that I spend a lot of time when I'm coaching people, sort of jumping through them, sort of assessing where people are at. I really like cultural intelligence as a way of helping people, get better, helping people develop, because it's not just about like learning a list of customs or even, understanding different ways of thinking. It goes deeper than that, and so it is this. This thing that you can develop. So it's not something you're stuck in, and it's also not something that you hold on to forever, because it might be that you get good at it in one situation and then you move to another situation and you need to relearn some things. So yeah, it's encouraging because it's capability, so it's development. It's not your personality, it's not what's in your head, because we can all relearn and learn. So that's really encouraging to me. It's something that can apply to anyone, and anyone can learn it. Yeah.
I love the way that you described it, and that approach, obviously, on the capabilities, just how simply you explained those. And I'm really interested in the work that you do specifically. Like, how do you use it? Like, what kind of use cases does cultural intelligence have in your world?
Yeah, so I still do work with people who are moving countries. So people who are usually at senior levels within an organization, and their company is saying to them, hey, do you want to go and work in Australia or Papua New Guinea or China? And people are usually recruited on the basis of their skill set, their capability in a professional field. So it might be because they're a good engineer, they're a good CEO, they're a good CFO, and yet that isn't what's going to determine their success. What's going to determine their success is their ability to adapt and to work well with the people where they are. So that is probably still a lot of the people that I work with. And then the other groups would be teams of people who have come from multicultural backgrounds. Sometimes age, but it's not often age, generational differences that are driving the reason that an organisation will reach out and say, hey, we want you to come work with us. But sometimes when you unpack it, those differences can be really powerful as well. So it can be a team that is having some challenges, and so an organisation wants somebody to work with them to help them to be better and to operate better. So yeah, so I'm mostly working with people in corporate situations, except a fair bit of this is unpaid work. I do quite a bit of work with psychologists because I come from a psychological background myself. I'm not clinical, though. I am very much an organisational psychologist. So what helps us to be at our best in a workplace? And so I'm often working with psychologists who are dealing with multicultural populations and helping them to apply their psychological, often clinical knowledge in that multicultural environment. And so often, especially, I think nowadays there is more of, and within psych, it's often referred to more as cultural competency. But I will often, help people. So I'll speak at conferences and things like that, which are looking at psychologists. Yeah.
Wow. I didn't realize that full range of the work that you were doing,
Oh,
including
well, I just feel
supporting the
like
psychologists.
I feel, it's one of my sources of frustration that so often it's not something that people have been trained in. And
Mm.
so, I really believe in the work that psychologists are doing because I am one. But and I'm not, one of the people at the front end of the mental health challenges, but I feel like I can help those of my colleagues who are, by helping them to be better when they're dealing with people who are different to them. And so it's really helping my colleagues to understand. So yeah, I've had some quite fun presentations at conferences in the last couple of years where I've been applying it to help my colleagues. Yeah.
Fantastic. And I'm really, there's a question that's been sort of bubbling in my head as you've been talking about that range of work that you do, which is I'm kind of curious, like when do you find ever individuals or teams who are resistant to the idea of cultural intelligence? I know in my work that I work with, again, a broad range of people, and they come to kind of whether it's coaching or facilitation or workshops with different attitudes about what this is about. Do you
Yeah.
ever come across people who are resistant?
Absolutely, yeah. And if you're working with a team, you can sometimes pick them up. They might be, looking at their body language. They might be sitting there with their arms folded and a bit of a frown on their face. And so, one of the things that I often think at that point is, where do we start? And so sometimes we might just start with talking about a problem, or we might start with the CQ drive aspect by trying to create a little bit of almost a moment of joy about somebody who's different to you. It can be a real moment where things shift somewhat. At the beginning of my podcast, I know you have some standard questions as well, but I have a standard question where I ask people, what is a culture other than the culture you grew up in that you've learned to love and appreciate? And sometimes just asking a room, tell me about a wonderful experience that you had with a culture that's different to you. And often you can see the people soften because they might talk about how, they got invited to their Greek neighbour's house, or, they went to an Orthodox christening, or, just different experiences that people have had. And sometimes when you see that moment of softening, it can be really helpful. I had this, we have here Harmony Day in Australia. And I always had this perspective that Harmony Day was a little bit of I'm trying to think of positive words here to describe it, but was a little bit of a sop, if you like, sort of, it was the day that people would bring in their food, in schools, kids would get dressed up in their costume of their ancestors, or, those sorts of days. Flags, food, and festivals are the sort of things that you focus on Harmony Day. And I remember once when I was leading a focus group about things that an organization was doing that were helpful. And, I was thinking about training and coaching and systems and processes. And this one guy who'd been really resistant throughout the whole conversation going, oh, I don't think we need to worry about it. And then I can't remember what the question was, but he talked about Harmony Day and how lovely it was that he said, all the Pacific Island guys, they brought in their food, and then, there was so-and-so playing music and people dancing the salsa, and it switched something within him. So sometimes I think we can find a point of resistance, and if we remind people that there can be some joy in other cultures, then we can overcome some of that resistance a little bit. And then when you've got a little bit more openness, you can sometimes work on some of the other, perhaps slightly harder things to help people learn about. Yeah.
I really like that idea of connecting to joy first and connecting to
Mm,
positive memories and experiences initially to open up the conversation. And
yeah.
ultimately, connection is what you're describing of Harmony Day. We don't quite have the same day here in the UK, but we do have moments in schools where things like this happen. And I do think that it's kind of a moment of connection, actually, interestingly. So I think that's
Yeah.
what it is. I love that feedback you had about the way that man appreciated it.
It was a really good lesson to me too.
Mm. And you mentioned, right at the beginning, the four capabilities, and you just touched on CQ Drive there. And so we have these four: CQ Drive, CQ Knowledge, CQ Strategy, and CQ Action. And I'm just really interested in your experience with the work that you do with organizations, teams, and individuals. Do you find that one is easier to develop and one is the most challenging? Is there a consistent pattern in this?
I think CQ knowledge is easier to develop. So it is, you can get lists of do's and don'ts. You can build your understanding around the cultural continuums, the different ways of thinking around individualism, collectivism, high power distance, low power distance. And you can slot all that away in your brain, and it can give you a feeling of comfort or confidence. But actually, it's a little bit dangerous because the research shows that CQ knowledge is not the most powerful capability in terms of effectively relating to people who are different to you. So it's an important one, but it's often when you like for expats, sometimes drive and strategy can be more important than knowledge. Like you don't need to know everything to actually be able to relate well with people. You can, if you're, leaning towards them with a positive motivation and energy, and then have the capability to reflect on the way that you're operating, you can do quite well even without knowing everything you might think you need to know. So knowledge can be a bit of a tricky one, because it's sort of easy to get, and yet it can trip you up a little bit. I think CQ strategy is the hard one, which is why my podcast focuses on it. So it's thinking about shifts, and the shifts are a lot more in perspective taking. And so I think trying to get people, I found sometimes some people operate, on a very practical element. And so you might say to them, what was going through your head at that time? And they might go, I don't know. Nothing was, I was just being, and so they're not necessarily as skilled at reflection. So asking questions like, do you ever journal? No. So getting people to step into a point of reflection can be quite hard. And so that's a little bit why I began the podcast, because I wanted to get better myself at helping other people to increase their CQ strategy and helping them to see the shifts they were making, and to be able to help others to help us as we look at helping other people make those shifts. Yeah.
I'm really
What
pleased you
about you?
mentioned. Well, I was going to say, this has made me very thoughtful because I think there's a lot of focus on CQ knowledge in the world more generally. So
Yeah.
I think what I find interesting is I sometimes work with individuals and teams who just want to know. They just want to know what is the list of things they need to know, like
Yep.
to be successful. And I think it can give a false sense of, as you say, confidence, of being in control. But then when somebody is not, they're interacting with individuals and people who are not conforming to
Yeah.
those like norms,
Don't
I
fit
think
in the box.
it don't fit in the box. It can be really disconcerting because you
Yeah.
think you've done your homework. And I find it a really interesting tension because I definitely have had moments in the past where I had an individual really pushing me to give them the list of things they just need to know. Just give me the
Yeah.
list. But the reality is, I think that misses the point. And I think, yes, seeking knowledge is easy to gain, but we have to treat it almost lightly, that it's not universal. It can't be true for every
Yeah.
individual. You're not the same as every other Australian person.
No.
I'm not the same as every other British person. So you know what, like that's kind of the interesting tension I find in my work.
Mm.
But I do agree. I think CQ strategy is interesting. But my follow up question on that is, I'm sure you're the same, working with really busy professionals under huge pressures to deliver at high levels.
Yeah.
That ability to pause and reflect, it's challenging. And I
It
know that.
is.
So I'm really curious, how do you sort of manage that with the people you help? Because that is often the question I'm asked is like, how
Yeah.
do I do this though? How do I actually make this happen practically?
and I'm pausing because it's not easy, and there's not a lot in the research around intuition, but there are some people whose intuition who seem to sort of respond a little bit more intuitively, and that intrigues me, and is always something where I'll try and get them to think afterwards, was that successful or was it not successful? So I might have questions that I try get people to hold. And I'm lucky in that a lot of the work that I do get the chance to give people the CQ assessment because the organisations are willing to pay for it. So I might identify if somebody is good in their awareness, but not in their checking, or vice versa. And actually, that's probably the one that I see more often, because often people who are racing into things, if they skip the planning and they're not very aware in the moment, if they can at least do a check back afterwards. So whether that's a check back with somebody else, we talk about how to develop a cultural mentor, how to find somebody who can be a sounding board for you, and you can say to them, how did I go in that meeting? How was my leadership? How was my communication? And so somebody can give you some feedback and say, yeah, that worked for us, or that didn't come across well at all. And so then they know they need to adjust some of their mental maps. Or vice versa, they might be good at checking and they don't normally plan because they just race on into things. And so to build a little bit of a planning moment in beforehand, and even if it's like at the beginning of a day, thinking what might the challenges be that I might encounter and how might I need to adapt the way that I'm operating to be effective. Because I know absolutely what you're saying. People are in such high pressured situations and they need to operate sometimes very quickly, and they may not have the opportunity to take a moment to pause and think. So I think if we are building in those processes, we are learning as we go. And so, it will then become familiar and people will get a feeling of, hang on, I've been here before. This person who's not responding, I'm going to have to change the questions I ask. So it will come. It just may take some time. And if you've got some of that recognition of where your skills do lie, so are they more in the planning beforehand? Is it in the moment awareness, or is it in the checking afterwards? Which one can I lean on? And then as I'm leaning on them, can I see how I might have been able to use the others as well? I often work, organisations when I began doing this work would always say, we want you for a day, or we want you for a half day, or something like that. And it took me a little while to get bold and courageous and say, look, a more effective method is to use a coaching approach if I'm just working with one or two people, and to sort of say, can I meet, have this conversation, and then come back in a couple of weeks' time? And so we will say, where might the pain points, where do you anticipate the pain points might be going to sit? And okay, in those moments, can you reflect on these things? And then when I come back, how did that go? What did you notice about yourself? What do you notice is always, the best question, because often people might be able to be trained to notice things, and then you've increased that awareness. So using a coaching framework, I actually find is really powerful, because it gives me a chance to come back to people to see how they're going in real life, and to be able to say, is it successful? Is it not successful? How can we adapt the processes? How can we build some other things in there? Are you usually coaching or training?
Well, both actually, interestingly. So I kind of reflecting on what you were saying, I think absolutely agree. I think if the CQ assessment is an opportunity within the program, I like to include it. So just to explain for those who are not familiar with it,
Thank you.
it gives a profile. It gives a sense of where your strengths and development areas are within each of those four capabilities, but broken down into subdimensions, such as you mentioning, Trisha, like the planning and the checking, the awareness. And I think, that's a very powerful starting point. But I agree. I'm increasingly in my work, it's a blend when I can really work and ensure that because I think for me, it's about embedding the impact, not just
Mm.
like a one-off, which is great. And there can be lots of energy, excitement behind a one-off intervention. But
Yeah.
I think things very quickly go back to normal. To really embed behaviors, that requires habit changes. It requires an ongoing action. It requires iteration because things won't go well the first time. You have to
Mm.
experiment to see what's going to work. So, the programs that I really value, and I think also bring the greatest results when I'm working with leaders, emerging leaders across several months, and it's a blend of coaching, workshops, facilitation, some self reflection, and sort
Yeah.
of homework as well. But yeah, I mean, I think we've always got to be adaptable in this world to what's needed.
Absolutely.
But it brings me, to a question, Richard, really, which is about this idea of where is cultural intelligence going? We're recording this. It's April
Yeah.
2026, the moment of recording, right at the end of April. We are in a moment of like lots of change happening in the world,
Mm.
on lots of fronts. And so I'm just curious on your perspective on this. Where is the world of cultural intelligence going? How is it evolving?
Yeah. And um, aside from the pain points, you and I have been speaking, well, I have been speaking about it a lot as an individual capability that people are developing. And I think one of the things that is shifting is that we're moving to a more collective perspective. And listeners, just at the beginning, Victoria and I were speaking about David Livermore's work with the Prism, which is looking at leadership styles and how different leaders present in different ways around the world. And all of that work is looking at how we can collectively, say in teams, approach those ideas, those pain points differently and negotiate some of those things, those ways of operating, giving leaders the skills to be able to do that. And so I think that's one of the aspects that's happening a little bit. I often see people, who are especially trying to take the systems and processes from one country to another country, and often acknowledging that the systems and processes are not necessarily going to work. Just like at the most basic level, I remember this guy who wanted to institute the employee of the month in Australia, which is a little bit uncomfortable, and it wasn't going down well at all. And so, I was trying to explain, well, Australians don't really want to wear a jacket that says employee of the month because that would be sort of a bit of a joke. So trying to explain the individualist but low power distance perspective, the tall poppy impact, all of those things. So the systems and processes that your organization might have are not necessarily going to export or import well into another country. And so, a CEO setting up somewhere new might need to think about how to not just adapt themselves, but adapt the organization and the ways of doing things. So thinking about the systems and processes. So it's like collective from a team and then collective from an organization as well. I think those are some of the things that are happening. But also, and a little bit, this goes back to me speaking at the conferences for free. One of the areas that I'm just thinking about a lot is social cohesion, and thinking about how, as a society, are we all relating well together, or let's face it, not relating well together, and how could we change that at that sort of level? And I know that change happens, sometimes one person at a time, but it also happens when you have leaders who are modeling it. It also happens when the systems around you are supporting different ways of operating. And so it's not just individuals, but it's also parts of society and the leaders within society who can influence. And so for me, thinking about society and what is happening, I don't know about what's happening in the UK, but certainly what's happening in Australia is there are some very loud voices being shared in media who are who are speaking. I mean, we're talking about relating to people with kindness and valuing people as being different but being valuable, and they're speaking as though that is not the way they want to operate. That they want to remove difference and they want to have a more homogenous society. So yeah, I'm feeling a lot that society has some challenges ahead of it. And I think there's a little bit of a shift that could happen in society, and we need to be able to think about how we speak to that. I honestly, it's such a big topic, but I recently spoke with one of the guys I met through the CQ Fellows, which is a group of cultural intelligence practitioners, and he comes from the entertainment industry, and so he wrote a book about storytelling. His name is Ned Legaspi. I can give you his details, but it was so fascinating to talk with him about movies, because I don't normally think about movies from a culturally intelligent perspective. And yet I think it's probably moving out into that sort of a field that we might be able to shift things within society. Seeing people who are capable of telling stories at a higher level than I will ever be capable of telling a story at. So I think there's lots of good things happening, even though there are some scary voices out there. I think there's lots of reason for optimism and hope. And so, yeah, that's a little bit where I think things are going. Sorry for dumping all that on you.
No, well, look, I mean, there's a lot there, and I think you're right to talk about that, because although, primarily, people might be listening to this from the point of view of workplace cultural intelligence, workplace communication, leadership in the workplace, there is a reality. When we're
Yeah.
talking about culture, we're not just ourselves in work, we are our whole selves. And
Yes.
what happens in the world more broadly impacts individuals, individually and collectively. That's how we also impacts how we show up at work as well. And so I think, this very neatly brings us back to some of the themes you talked about right at the beginning of today's podcast, about belonging, about
Mm.
then the need for connection, and ultimately what this work, cultural intelligence, is about, which is, helping us to see difference, appreciate it, to bridge
Yeah.
those differences, and be that sort of little bit better, be able to understand how we kind of can adapt. Just that one, I think it was 10%. We talked about the idea of the
Yes.
10% movement David Livermore referred to. So, thank you, Trisha, so much for coming today to share these insights into how you see cultural intelligence, how you're using it in your work, how it's evolving. Do you have any sort of final words about what you'd really love just to leave listeners with as a sort of final idea around this?
I think I do want to leave people with hope, and to leave people with the awareness that, when you and I think we probably started in this field, some time ago, both of us, and there wasn't a lot of people speaking about it. And the people who were speaking about it were probably coming at it from learn this list of things, rather than be able to relate to anybody who's different to you, and value those differences. So I think, but I'm very aware now that there is a vast group of us, which is so encouraging. I find it encouraging that it's not just sort of a small number of us doing this work, but there's a growing number, and that people are increasingly positive about the work. So there's a lot of people. I mean, sometimes it feels like the negative voices are the louder ones, but you just need to open yourself up, and I'm sure you will meet people who are doing similar work or who have similar beliefs as well. So I think there is reason for hope, and there is reason for optimism, and we've got work to do, and we can do that.
Excellent. I love those final words. And you are one of those positive voices for hope. So, how can people learn more about what you do, listen to your podcast? Would you mind just sharing a little bit of the ways for people to connect and follow you now?
Sure. So my podcast is called The Shift. I loved the name, but there are a few the shifts. So you might need to put in the shift with Trisha Carter, and I'm sure, Victoria, that you'll put a link into it in your show notes. And so, yeah, but I would also love to connect with anybody who's listening on LinkedIn. So I accept almost all invitations. So please just feel free to reach out and send me an invitation to join on LinkedIn as well. And I'd love to connect with you to learn more about the background of your listeners.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Trisha, for joining us today. It was a great pleasure. Love this conversation. Really appreciate it, particularly as you've joined us in your early evening today. But thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me, Victoria, and thank you for the work that your podcast is doing. I've been really encouraged listening to the episodes, and yeah, good on you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Trisha. I really appreciate it. And thanks to everyone for listening. Really look forward to seeing you on a future episode.